most of his research and his many writings on labor issues. He's the co-chair of the Federal Public Sector and Industry Council of the Labor and Employment Relations Association, and he earned a doctorate in labor and industrial relations from the University of Illinois. He also serves on the editorial boards of the Journal of Labor Research and the International Journal of E-Politics. Merit can be sure to provide a great academic and research-based perspective on what we've seen tonight. To my right, we have Carla Swift, the president of the Michigan AFL-CIO and a great female leader in the movement, as well as a leader in the state of Michigan. She began her life's career of labor activism as a rank-and-file member of the UAW Local 483 and worked for General Motors, and then became a union organizer. She previously served as the state director of We Are the People, which is a coalition of students, seniors, and workers fighting to protect Michigan's middle class. And she also worked for Wayne County and the United Way of Southeastern Michigan and holds a teaching degree from Michigan State University. And then also to my right, we have Bruce Miller of Miller Cohen, who is a Wayne Law alum from class of 1954 and a longtime labor and civil rights activist. He's currently the general counsel for the Metro AFL-CIO and serves as a mentor to many other aspiring labor attorneys and labor activists. He's also served as the general counsel for the Michigan AFL-CIO and is an attorney for and chairman of the Legal Redress Committee for the Detroit branch of the NAACP. He's also written and lectured extensively on labor's issues, won numerous honors, and of course is a partner at Miller Cohen based in Detroit. So with these panelists, I'm going to ask a few questions myself to get things started, and then we'll open up to the audience. So if you have questions, reflections, thoughts on the film, please be thinking about sharing them and any questions you have for our panel. But I'm going to start by opening it up for each of our panelists to offer their reflections on the film. I know I was kind of struck by the intense courage and leadership that we saw from the Reuther family and we know many others. The origins of organizing and the growth of the UAW, and was in the arguments made against organizing in the 1920s and 1930s, was really struck by how many of those arguments we still hear identical today, and how oftentimes we feel that we have changed, we've grown, but in many ways the fight continues, and we are still fighting the same battles and still doing the same work. So I'm interested in opening it up to our panel to each individually reflect on what we can learn about this film, the reflections of this film, and how it applies to today's labor struggles. Anyone like to start, or I can start? Actually, Carla.
Ladies first.
I'll take a crack at it. For me, this was a very moving thing. I was a soldier in these wars with people like Mike Kerwin sitting back there. And as I look at these films, I relive experiences. And I see people who were very important to me and to the movement. One of them is Horace Sheffield. He appears in the film twice. Once standing with Martin Luther King, and another time standing with Victor, comforting Victor. Horace played a very, very important role in the organization of the UAW. During the Ford strike, many black workers did not come out to join the strike. Horace was the leader of the youth group of the NAACP. And he and Walter White, who was executive director of the National NAACP, marched to Miller Road and called on the black workers who had stayed in to come out. One of them was Buddy Battle, if you may remember. He was inside. They came out. That's an enormous thing to happen. And it made the strike successful. And part of the greatness of Walter was that he surrounded himself with people like Horace Sheffield. built them up and made them important. So that's just an observation.
Yes, thank you. Those are great, great thoughts. Parts of your relationships to share. I want to say thank you, Sasha, for creating this wonderful story that needs to be told because it is full of richness and courage, and on so many levels. In watching the film, I'm a 37-year UAW member. I became a UAW member in 1977. So did not have the opportunity to be a part of any of the early struggles, obviously, and the modern struggles seem to pale a little bit in comparison, although I think there are enormous struggles today that the same type of passion and courage and energy is going to have to be brought forward in order to win. And I'm imagining that if the Reuther brothers were around today, they'd be leading the struggles for our Walmart and for the fast food workers and for the minimum wage, increasing the minimum wage. And I feel enormously proud to have my personal relationship with the UAW and to have this story now and this documentary to share and hopefully inspire folks in the battles that we really are in today, which have a lot of parallels, but they're the modern day battles between organized people and organized money. And right now, the organized money side is winning in many, many ways, and we need to find our center again as organized people.
Mayor?
I'd like to thank Sasha for this documentary as well, not only for recapturing the past, but the opportunity it provides to educate the future. And I hope that many younger people will have an opportunity to see it and be able to recall the tremendous strides that were made by organized labor at tremendous costs. But three things really struck me about the movie. One is the greatness of the leaders, which were transformational leaders, very inspirational leaders, not just transactional leaders as we find in many corporations, but people who tried to build a new society, people like Martin Luther King and Walter Reuther. The timeless values that they spoke to is something else that also struck me as being very, very telling. How many people do you hear today talk about the moral obligation to working people? It is more like the bankrupting of worker benefits that we hear a lot about. And I think that's a function of the third powerful part about this movie, which is often overlooked in our society in general today, and that is to give full expression to these timeless values, you have to have an institutional force behind them. And that institutional force has been and will be the labor movement. And the unfortunate reality is that you don't hear a lot of these values expressed today because the labor movement doesn't have the presence that it did at its peak days. And it's not fashionable anymore to speak of those time-honored values. It's more fashionable to talk in terms such as corporate freedoms, unregulated markets, free trade, and ignore the consequences of all of those things. So I hope we have a chance to reflect on really what it will take to transform society today, because I think that is what the legacy of these three brothers would be best served by.
Thank you. And Sasha, I'm interested in your reflections and also hearing a little bit about how the film's been received in other parts of the country where you've shown it.
Sure. I can play off what we were speaking on because there are two different audiences somewhat that I've had a chance to screen screen for me. There are those of a certain generation that remember these pieces of history that are very thankful to sort of relive or experience or have those captured again. But then I'm most excited to hear from young folks, my age and younger, that have been motivated by what they see, because it's a perfect example of a people's movement. And there's so many bodies in the street, and this kind of activism they haven't really seen in their generation and before. And they see these coalitions, the coalition of conscience, so to speak, that they don't know that sort of tangible thing. So they often ask me, where are these groups today, and how is this happening today? We sort of feel like it must be out there because we had Occupy Wall Street and we had some of these things, but how can these groups come together again? Is labor involved in these things? What is social unionism? So the great thing is, I may not necessarily right at the moment have all the answers, but they're asking the questions and they're very curious. And these are more than just students; they're young workers. As I mentioned earlier, this is in Montana, and it's in Texas, and Oregon, Wisconsin, Indiana, and other places in the South. So it's all over the place. So I'm most excited to try to get this film out there, at least to begin, the young folks to begin to ask these questions. Is there an additional question?
Or just the reflection, any reflections you have in the journey of creating this film, what you learned, and what surprised you perhaps?
Yeah, I think for me, I grew up around many of these stories, but I was often too young to sort of appreciate the greater scope. My grandfather had a glass eye from an assassination attempt, so I was bowled over by the drama. But then, in my college years, when I was lucky enough, I was at NYU, and I knew my grandfather was in his 80s, but still telling these great stories. Fortunately, we sat together for all the interviews that you see in the film. I didn't know what I was going to do with it, but I sat with him with the camera, and he recalled all of his stories from his memoir. And then I began to sort of fill in the blanks of this amazing American history, and I did further research myself. And in making this film, past his death, we began in 2007 making this film, spending time here at the Reuther Library in Wayne State, and also digging through the presidential libraries, coming across the Lyndon Johnson phone call tapes that really expanded the film much more than I could have expected. And that really added several scenes to a story that I knew that there was somewhat of an open door for the Reuthers with the Democratic presidents, with Kennedy and Johnson administrations, but I had no idea it was like that, where they really were close enough that they worked together on certain policy, but they would have these somewhat intimate phone calls. So it 100% enhanced my understanding of American history, but it just unearthed a lot of these interesting sort of side moments that I think most people don't know of in general, no matter what generation you come from. So I was delighted to sort of unearth something that hadn't been covered much, maybe in certain books here and there, but not really told on screen like this. So it was really an adventure, sort of digging up all these interesting gems.
I'd like to open it up to the audience now for questions with this panel. Anyone have a question? Yes.
How you doing? Jerry King from UAW Local 140. Hello, everyone. I want to thank everyone that put this together and all of the people that gave resources. One of the things that I want to share a vision with you. Our story isn't being told in the schools, and we haven't built that political power to make that happen yet. So, one of the things that we kind of need is a mecca for labor, a museum. Richard Rubin, which is one of the on the board of the Tea Place, you're familiar with the Henry Ford, the original factory where the plan came together to build the modern day assembly line? Well, on that land, that's a historical land. Oh, sorry. That's
a big help. My hearing isn't that hard. How about an old man?
So I'm talking about the Tea Place, the original plan on Pequot, where Henry Ford and the Dodge brothers came together and funded that operation, which led to the Dodge brothers' growth and Henry Ford's growth, and the eventual modern day assembly line. That property right now is a museum, and it's coming up, it's really getting together. And the vision that Richard Rubin has there is to purchase the remaining land around that area and have exhibits of the 25 original automobile companies in metropolitan Detroit area. And with that vision, he tells me that he wants labor, UAW and others, to come in and staff this place, to tell the story as school children come into this facility. And they have a very nice plan and it's all documented. So I just wanted to share this vision with you guys. And I don't know if you had talked to Richard or know of his vision, but we need some kind of method that can be operational, that people can be drawn to as we work to build the leverage to get it back into our curriculums in school. Thank you.
That sounds amazing. I hadn't heard of it. I mean, an addition to that, I can say that my sort of part in making this film and just scratching the surface to the amazing footage and photos and documents that they have here at the Reuther Library. More of this as well, not necessarily just in the 80-minute form we watched tonight, but even short sort of mini pods of videos, a 5-minute something on a different labor subject that they have right here and available. So those kind of things would be great to also educate. Yes, I agree, a brick and mortar establishment would be amazing, but also opportunities for folks to click on a link anywhere in the world and learn about this kind of history. More of it is equally important, but that sounds great.
Another question?
Yes, Tipa Sayika, Local 51, UAW Chrysler. I was just going to inquire about, maybe somebody can give us a little more information on what it's going to take probably to get the people at Walmart's to get organized. Maybe you all got some efforts going on, or you know some situations that's taking place right now to get that better established. I'm quite sure Walter Ruth was here, someone said up there, I'm quite sure there's some heavy struggles going on in that area. And then also, a lot of the foreign auto companies in the southern area of the country, in their homes, countries, are they unionized in their home countries?
Current efforts to organize and
Well, organizing in the South is extremely difficult for a number of reasons. One is the anti-union climate politically is enormous. Secondly, these automobile plants in the South pay wages and provide working conditions to essentially rural workers that are very, very rich in terms of what their general level of incomes would otherwise be. So you have to overcome the political barrier. And any time a worker has to consider whether or not he's going to join a union, he makes a cost-benefit analysis. Just like anybody else does. What's the risk? What's the gain? And when you have these kinds of forces arrayed against the organizing, workers will often decide that the risk is not worth the gain. It's very difficult because the climate is so bad. And I was thinking when I watched this film, something about organizing. When the movement first started, it was extraordinarily difficult to organize because of the dangers that were involved. I mean, you ran physical risks. You lost your job, you got beat up, you might have gotten shot. So how did it happen? And the reason it happened is because what fears people had were sublimated by being part of a movement. And the movement gave them courage and sustained them. Thousands of people marched together, and it made people brave who would otherwise be afraid. And I think now about how work is organized. And it's been my experience that the ones who get involved in organizing their union in the absence of this large movement, where they're organizing on a factory basis, one by one by one, how enormously brave they are, what courage they have. They don't have a large movement to sustain them. They operate in 2s and 3s and 4s. And they know that if they move towards union organization, they may get fired. It'll take years before the National Labor Relations Board will will ever get them back to work. They run these enormous risks, but they still organize. They don't organize like they used to organize when the climate gave them support, but they still organize. And I thought of that difference in the climate of organizing and how it affects things.
Carla, I'm interested in your reaction to that.
Sure. Yeah, and there's, very, very true. I spent about 10 years doing organizing when I was with the UAW International Union, and having began my work and joined the UAW as in a warehouse, in a General Motors warehouse, where there was already a contract in place where I didn't have to do anything courageous to enjoy the benefits of a union contract. And it wasn't until I really started working with workers who were organizing unions in their workplaces that I began to understand how incredibly difficult it can be, and what really courage and solidarity mean when they come together, because workers can win if you can put those two things together. And solidarity is bigger than the workers inside the workplace. So where there is solidarity in a community that wraps itself around workers, whether it's the faith-based community or other kinds of community-based organizations, the currently organized workers in a community, whatever it is, that shares the values of having a voice at work and respect and dignity in the workplace, and a fair, conditions of fairness for in the workplace for workers. Putting that together, that's the solidarity that is so critical to workers being successful. And so while I'm not very close to it, I believe that a lot of that is the work that has been being worked on for quite a few years now as organizing goes on in the southern plants where workers are trying to organize. And if you think about the timeline here, and I don't know what the beginning of it was, when workers first started, but was it 1920? Was it somewhere around there, right? Okay. And they won a contract at Ford, the first contract at Ford in 1941, right? And sat down at General Motors in 1937. These are long struggles. And this was when there were the critical mass of workers who were courageously standing up for themselves and joining the union was enormous, enormous numbers of workers, enormous density of workers supporting having fairness in the workplace and having democracy in the workplace, right? And it still took many, many years to win recognition and win that first contract. So the struggle just has many parts to it. It's very, very complex. And I'd like to just go back to what I said earlier, that we are in an environment where we have to think about the context of organized people versus organized money. And they had organized money back in the 20s and the 30s and the 40s, and you saw what that looked like. The organized money today is not as obvious in some ways. It's very insidious, when you think about on the political spectrum and the people that are fighting to pass right to work in Michigan and were successful to pass right to work in Michigan, when the people that are fighting to take away all measure of rights for workers and women and seniors and these pop-up C4 organizations that aren't supposed to be political organizations, but that's really all they do. And there's dozens and dozens and dozens of them. And we need to get into a frame where we're operating in the context that exists today, understanding the the rich history of the past and taking forward what we know works and what is good, and you know, the organizing, there's fundamental principles of organizing that work today and work every day when they're applied, and again, when you have when you put together the conditions that are necessary. But we're in a different context today, and we have to get very, very much smarter and better organized on the organized people side, which has to be much broader than the labor movement. I don't care where you're operating in this country. It has to be a broad movement. And we have to recognize that these are not events that are won. These are sort of longer term struggles, and you have to be in it for the long haul.
Good question up here.
First of all, is that on? Yes. First of all, Mr. Ruther, thank you so much. This is really a great documentary, and the events and the rest of the law folks that brought us this, thank you. Really was a great event. I suppose my question is, my name is Kathleen Garbach, I'm a J out there at Lane. And as a young person interested in being a part of the labor movement, and making a career out of it, I think we talked a little bit tonight about this almost complacency. You've seen what our fathers and grandfathers and great-grandfathers and grandmothers have done for the movement. And for my generation, in a big way, has been able to sit back and enjoy the results of all of that hard work. So I think, how do we get people energized in general and excited and ready to bring justice to the workplace again? Because I think we've been in place for far too long, and you're starting to see, you know, the results of us just sitting back for the past 20 years. And now we've got right to work in Michigan, of all places, and things like that. So how do I, as a young person, make a difference?
Great question.
That's a good question. I can comment on it briefly. Well, I think first of all, communicating and being involved in social media is a big start. Obviously, like that is, there's good and bad to that. That's an online community, so the bodies are not out in the street, and maybe they're not as impactful that way. So that there's an element of sort of getting the word out that's very helpful in that sense. Then I think about, interestingly enough, not long ago I watched another documentary on Freedom Summer, 1964, and I think about that movement in the sense that there were a lot of young folks involved in that movement that what they were fighting for did not initially impact them, but they believed so strongly in getting involved. And students from the north came down south, and the elements of that, feeling strongly enough that you want to get involved. I know for a fact there are labor and non-labor activism groups in every state that are doing things, and it's a matter of finding them. And most of them are online, on social media. So the great thing is reach out to any number of these groups, and whether it's the AFL-CIO or we have in New York, there's the Freelancers Union. I mean, there's groups that are doing things that are a little bit outside of the typical sphere, and maybe it's not necessarily a labor group, but there's a lot of activists that feel like our backs are against the wall and they're right up against the wall, and there's not much further you can push us, and we want to do something. And I'm so happy to hear that, because I've heard this around the country. So I think, you know, my little tidbit is that there are these groups out there, and reaching out, they would, I'm sure, be enthusiastic about your help in doing things. Even though you're not necessarily a union member, I think they've sort of backed off a little bit in the sense that you have to be a union member to get involved in these movements. They need the bodies in the street. They need people writing letters and, you know, posting messages on Facebook. So I would just suggest to reach out to the groups that probably do have a presence online already, just as a start.
The focus, the focus of the battle has somewhat shifted. We don't have these great organizing campaigns that you can volunteer and become a part of. Although there are things that are going on in Walmart that require people to participate, and they're not necessarily actual members of any particular union, largely because there's no union there, and the trouble is to try and get them organized. So the battle has sort of has shifted in some respects, and one of the ways to be helpful to the labor movement is to support it, to defend it. There's no shame to this history. All the things that were spoken to in the documentary are still true. You look at that appearance before the legislature, and you have this reactionary SOB complaining about unions financing elections and participating in elections. And you listen to the Mackinac Center today, and it's the same kind of crap. The same enemies are out there. But you can't defeat them if you're not in a union on a picket line. A picket line doesn't solve that problem. It's a political problem. It has to be solved in the political arena. And in the political arena, there are many, many opportunities to become involved, to be a militant, to press doorbells, to participate in political rallies, and to create an atmosphere that protects the labor movement and its values and the values of the broader society for which it speaks.
Sure. There are a number of ways to get involved and things that you can do that I think are really, really productive. First of all, you can use this film. This film makes an understanding of what the labor movement is about accessible to so many people, and I'm so glad to hear that teachers are using it, and we need to really drive this into the teachers unions and all of the unions that operate in the schools, so that we can get accurate history back in front of people. If you're in a workplace that is unorganized and you have the opportunity to form a union in your workplace, that is one of the most powerful ways to get involved in the labor movement. Be the labor movement. Don't just be, on the outside, if you will, and help build power for workers inside the workplace. And yes, there are all measure of civil rights organizing that's going on, immigrant rights organizing, economic justice, political organizing, and I'd just like to plug a political organizing activity that's going on right now, because we are a mere 2.5 weeks away from an extremely important election. The most important election in your lives. How many times have we heard that one? It is totally 2014. It's the most important election, certainly in my life. And there is a coalition that is at work that has its center in the labor movement, but it's including a lot of other groups on the progressive side, whether it's the women's rights folks or the environmentalists, immigrant rights folks, the economic justice folks, and it's called Workers' Voice. And there are about 18 Workers' Voice volunteer centers around the state today, and they're doing canvassing every single day and phone banking a number of times a week. And so if you can go to the MichiganAFL-CIO.org website, and under the Action Center tab, click on volunteer and find out where those volunteer centers are. You can show up, you can get out on the doors, and you can do some of the work of helping working people win on November 4th. That would be fantastic.
This question over here.
Good evening. My name is Sonia Belafont. I am a nonprofit attorney in the city of Detroit. And actually, I wanted to thank, first of all, Sasha, because as a result of the documentary, I now have a better perspective of the foundation by which I was able to become an attorney, raised in the city of Detroit by a father who worked for Ford Motor Company. So my utmost appreciation for giving me that foundation. But my question actually has to do with my disconnect with trying to explain what organizing and what movements are to my 17-year-old daughter or some of my younger students. And so how can we how can we, while recognizing we've lost a lot of leaders, and that there aren't many that are coming forth in the generation going through the educational system now, which, as we all know, has been essentially gutted to some degree, how can we now begin to establish something in the school systems to give them an idea of what the movement meant, or how it can go forward, and how it can be brought down to a level to which they can understand, so they can begin to research or re-galvanize the movement, so they can relate to all the things that are going on now and begin to take a stand and be less passive.
Take that.
I'll make a comment on that. I think you raise a very interesting question. I have 5 children myself, 5 millennials. They range in age from 21 to 31. And I would say that most of them are not terribly socially or politically active. They're very economically motivated, I might say. It's really important to remember, and this goes to the question up there about what you can do to be involved in the labor movement. And I think Bruce had a very good answer to that. In my judgment, I'll be blunt about this, organized labor has lost the political debate because it's lost the philosophical argument, because people don't make the argument basically why there's a moral obligation to have a strong labor movement. And until we start making that argument on a regular basis and demanding that political officials not just pay lip service, but actually pay attention to it, I don't think we're going to capture the passion that we had for labor in the 1930s and 1940s. Remember, labor peaked in my birth year, 1954, to telegraph how old I am. It's been in decline since then. And I think that really the apex of pro-labor forces was in the 1930s and 1940s, when you had very strong advocates like Hubert Humphrey promoting the cause of organized labor in a very articulate manner. I'll just say 2 quick things. To show how important this issue was at a different time period, people think the first debate between John Kennedy and Richard Nixon was in 1960. It was in 1947. It was in McKeesport, Pennsylvania. And they went there to debate the Taft-Hartley Act. They went on the train together. They slept in the same car. They flipped a coin for which bunk, who got which bunk. Kennedy got the bottom bunk. Nixon got the top one. They debated that in front of an audience in McKeesport, and both of them were on the House Labor Committee on different sides. And if you go back, Hubert Humphrey's maiden speeches in the United States Senate, which were made in 1949, he gave a series of them on the rights of workers. And this was in reaction to Taft-Hartley's passage, the anti-union aspects of that, such as the provision for right to work. I don't know of a political figure today on the national scene that could stand up and give that kind of a talk and have one clue about what they were talking about. And I think that if people see people in that position advocating worker rights, and I just wrote down a couple quick things, here's the debate, how we've gone from it. We went, as in the movie, talking about worker rights. What do we talk about today? Corporate freedoms, unlimited political spending. We've gone from talking about advancing economic well-being to stripping benefits. Those public workers shouldn't have defined benefit plans. It's dangerous. It's really dangerous, and we should nullify our contracts and take it away from them. And then we've gone to waging a war on poverty, to waging a war on the poor. The poor are responsible for these things. Let them suffer. Take away their benefits. So that's the way we change things. Until we change that debate, until we change our appreciation for the forces of social and economic justice, and that becomes really the tone of the discussion that takes place, and we go on the offense instead of being on the defense all the time. I'm just making one final note about one thing we talked about, the South and how difficult it is to organize there, and I've lived in the South. Let me tell you, there is not a single region in this country where it's easy to organize. whether you're north, south, east, west. And remember, as we talked about before, Michigan is a right to work state, just like Alabama.
We have time for one last question, and then I'm sure our panelists will stick around for more conversation.
Thank you very much. My name is Rich Feldman, and I spent 30 years at the Wayne Truck Plant, and I've been in the union for 40 years. I want to say a brief comment and then a question. Brief comment is, we do live in movement times. When 350,000 people come together in New York, when what happened in Ferguson, people stand up, when people stand up against the water struggle here, when people are creating peace zones in Detroit, when people are creating urban gardens, I think we have concepts of movement that are from another historical moment. And we really need to look at ourselves and look in the mirror. I think the contradiction that you somewhat pointed out in the film between being a movement and an institution is really, really the contradiction that we don't know how to deal with as organizations. One of the proudest moments for myself in the union right now is working with Women Creating Caring Communities, which is women breaking down the walls between workplace and community about how do you heal ourselves and heal our communities. But it takes looking in the mirror. Here's my question to you, Sasha. You did a really good job on what happened around Vietnam in the struggle. You did a good job pointing out the contradiction with the League of Revolutionary Black Workers. How did you decide not to make a comment, unless I missed it, about John Lewis and the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party? Because the root of what it means to be a movement is the contradiction when you become an institution, as the UAW became, trying to figure out how to balance its power and its influence on other issues and lose its moral compass in many ways.
I can be honest with you, we were cutting that scene and many others. We were cutting also, there's really no mention in the film of World War II and the workers in the factories and how much that changed the UAW and the arsenal of democracy. And there's a huge element. There are big swaths of history that we unfortunately were not able to put in. We were very focused on a certain length of this film. It was my first feature, and I didn't want to get into a situation where I had a 3-hour epic, which we couldn't sell even to digital venues like Netflix and things where maybe there's not much of a time constraint. I was very worried about going too deep and not able to sell it to PBS or HBO or places that were looking. So in all honesty, I looked at the trajectory of their legacy and had to sort of decide, is this enough to get across this element? Is this enough to show some of the controversy, the political elements, the sort of movements from within the UAW that were hitting a glass ceiling? So we unfortunately couldn't include it all, and I very much wanted to tell that story. In fact, I was approaching John Lewis. He was on the list to talk to, but we could never get an interview with him. We pursued him and Senator Kennedy for about a year and a half, and we're so fortunate to get Ted Kennedy. Actually, we were probably the last non-news organization to sit with Senator Kennedy, and we could never get to sit down with John Lewis while I was still making the film. So it's very much in my notes, and I was so sad that we couldn't put it in because it's a fascinating story. And I agree, it was really interesting to see Walter Reuther right in the middle of that mix of the Freedom Democrats.
Is there a sequel? I mean, you gotta do a part two.
Yeah, well, we could also do Sisters on the Line, because there's so many women's stories.
Our panelists of Detroit artifacts to celebrate the city, and Sasha, we have a special gift for you, a portrait that was made with the Reaper brothers.
Yes.